So thank you all for joining this this virtual book launch for Tara Lal's memoir, Standing on My Brother's Shoulders, Making Peace with Grief and Suicide. We acknowledge the traditional owners of country throughout Australia and recognise their continuing connection to land, waters and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present and emerging. We'd like to also acknowledge anyone joining who has lived experience of mental health, through your own experience, supporting family or friends, or if you've been bereaved or impacted by suicide. If this conversation triggers you, there are support services that you can contact, and those details have just been provided in the Zoom chat box, thanks to Laura. Today is Are You OK Day in Australia and World Suicide Prevention Day. I know Tara wants to say a few words about World Suicide Prevention Day. Over to you, Tara.
Thanks, Dean, and thank you so much, everyone, for joining us from all over the world. It's really such an honour to have you all here, and especially today being World Suicide Prevention Day. And it's a day which, you know, I feel so strongly about, and it needs to be acknowledged, and never more so than now. And I really hope that in the next hour we can have a conversation that makes a valuable contribution to this day by talking about some incredibly difficult but very real topics in a healthy, supportive and constructive way that comes also with a message of hope.
Yeah, thanks, Tara. And as Tara said, we want this to be a conversation. So I've got a lot of questions to ask Tara, but let me get the first few questions in, and I'd love it if people want to post questions in the chat room, the chat group, and then I can throw them to Tara. So Tara, let's start off by, if you could describe growing up in your family household in London for us, thanks.
Yeah, so it was, we grew up in the 70s in North London, and I was the youngest of 3 children. So my brother was 2 years older than me, and then my sister Jo was 4 years older. And my mum was English and blonde and blue-eyed, and she had curly hair, and she was had a statuesque build, and she was quite bold and forthright, and she had a fiery temper. But she was also the backbone of the family, and she really held us together. And my father was really completely opposite. He is Indian, and he came over from India when he was 6 years old. But he's very passive and gentle. And, you know, when my mother would start to shout, he'd go, oh, Tara, I do wish you wouldn't, oh, Bridget, I do wish you wouldn't swear. But he was also quite eccentric. And, you know, he would say things like, oh, Tara, how do you use this water heating device? And I'd go, Dad, it's a kettle. And I don't know how old I was, at which point I realised that my dad was not well and that he was depressed, but I found a diary entry that I'd written probably when I was about 8, and it said, Dad's depressed. I hate it when Dad's depressed because I always think that it's my fault. And I think that really played out. I grew up thinking that everything was my fault. And the way that I could tell when Dad was not well was that, you know, he absolutely loved to read. That was his passion. But when he was depressed, he wouldn't have a book on his knee and he wouldn't be able to read. And the illness really took it from him. And I remember climbing onto his lap and trying to get him to give me a hug. And it just felt like there was this, he was enclosed in this tomb, and I tried so hard to reach him and I wasn't able to. Thank you. I used to try and lift his arm up and try and get him to give me a hug, and he just wasn't able to do that. And then when I was 8, my mum became ill with cancer, and I really saw during that time how both my mother's and my father's illnesses were really equally disabling for them, and had such an impact on both of their lives, on their relationships, you know, on the amount of pain that they were in, and in so many ways, and it really impacted all of us, I think.
Yeah. When your mum tragically died of cancer, you were 13 and Adam was 15. Can you talk a bit about the bond that grew between Adam and you?
Yeah, I mean, you know, Dad was admitted to a psychiatric hospital after Mum died, and so he was really quite absent. And my sister was 17 at the time, and she had a partner, so she was often away. And so Adam and I really turned to each other, and he really protected me, and he made me feel safe at a time when everyone else in the world really did feel that safe. And he certainly created my pain for me. And he was the only one that I felt really understood me, and we didn't speak about our grief, but we had this unspoken understanding, and it really connected us, and we built a really special and unique bond.
In his late teens, Adam battled depression and anxiety. Did he keep his illness to himself?
Very much so. You know, no one really saw it and no one really knew. And, you know, towards the end, he started to give little hints to a few people that you know, he wasn't quite his usual self, but no one really knew the depths of the despair that he felt. And it was only really in his writing that I found after he died that he really expressed how much pain and distress he was in. And I think I realized what a huge dichotomy there was between the face that he showed to the world and what was actually going on inside him. And I really see now and believe that that mismatch between the two really feeds so much mental illness and exacerbates it. And I guess for me, my book has really allowed me to be seen for all my imperfections and all my broken parts. And that was actually incredibly healing, and it freed me from the chains that I really felt that I was constrained by. And it allowed me to be true to myself, and ultimately, I guess, to live my own truth.
In the years after Adam tragically took his own life, how did you cope, Tara?
You know, I just ran, and I never stopped. And I really wanted to, I tried so desperately, I wanted to leave everything behind. And so I traveled and I moved to Australia 7 years after Adam had died. And, you know, because I was traveling, no one really knew me. And so I never really spoke about it. And I never really had a voice, but I think I also felt kind of very silenced as well, unintentionally, by other people and the fear that they had, perhaps that I would do what Adam had done. And I really felt that silencing was so damaging. And I guess I really dissociated Adam and my brother from suicide. To me, they were completely separate things. And I tried very hard to kind of block out any talk of suicide. And really, that was probably about 15 years of my life I turned away from it.
When you say you travel, I mean, I've read your memoir, and it's amazing the sort of things that you did in the parts of the world you went to. Can you just tell us one of those, talk about one of those experiences, for example?
Well, I went to Zimbabwe, and I had done a selection weekend to take part in that before Adam had died. And then it was really, I was actually there over the first anniversary of his death. And I think just being away, being in Africa, building schools with my bare hands, being, you know, seeing these people all around me at 18 years old who had absolutely nothing, but were smiling and seemed so happy. And it just really gave me that sense of hope that I could be happy again, and that I didn't have to be completely defined by my experiences at that point. And I think that was such an important thing for me to have at that moment, especially over the first anniversary of his death, to realize that at least there was hope and I could be happy again. And I really appreciate that simplicity and the simple things in life.
Actually, just an interesting question here from Karen, who asks if your anonymity through travel was a safety mechanism for you. Do you think that was the case?
I think it probably not certainly not intentionally, but I think in some ways, and you know, it was a difficult thing because it came from all directions. I do remember being at university, because I went to university soon after in Scotland, and sort of feeling like I wanted to speak. And I remember sort of trying to bring it up at some point, and a friend sort of looking at me and going, no, like don't say it, don't bring it up. And so I very much felt like I wasn't allowed to. And then it became comfortable. It became very comfortable to not have to answer those questions.
Tara, what do you think you were ultimately running from?
Myself and everything that was going on inside me. And it was such a violent storm, really, of such conflicting emotions. You know, I had this really intense fear that it would happen to me, or that I would become like my father. And I think that fear really dictated my behavior and came with me everywhere for so long. You know, and I had this sense of betrayal, that my brother had said that he would always be here for me, and he wasn't. And I think that really you know, affected my sense of trust in other people and trust in the world. And I had a huge sense of rejection, and that very much stayed with me, and I couldn't understand why I seemed to be so hypersensitive to rejection. And I remember a friend saying to me many years later that she had felt that Adam's death was the ultimate rejection of her love. And at that point, I just went, yeah, that's exactly what it felt like. It felt like my love wasn't enough, and it wasn't enough to keep him alive. And, you know, and I had this huge sense of anger as well. And I think, you know, the anger perhaps was one of the hardest things for me to really come to terms with. And I really suppressed it and repressed it. And that was hurting me. And I didn't realize that. And I used to kind of siphon off this anger to other people and just really push it down. And it was so difficult to process that and allow myself to be angry and to even feel what anger was, and especially towards Adam. You know, and I think I very much also had this horrible sense of shame, shame that I was a bad person. I was a bad person because I hadn't been able to save my brother or my mother. And that came with me, and that sense of I was only, you know, my self-worth really. So I think I was running from all of those really intense emotions, you know, as well as obviously, you know, intense grief.
Was there a point in time where you just thought, I've got to stop running, I have to face this?
Yeah, absolutely. I think, you know, when I was about 32, and there was a whole load of things that all seemed to happen at the same time. So I went to a call as a firefighter that was a suicide. And I had a really physical, visceral reaction to that, and where I felt I was going to vomit. And at the same time, I had a colleague who attempted suicide and wrote this letter that just reached straight into my heart and just pulled it apart really. And I also had the breakdown of a very short but quite intense relationship. And when that relationship ended, it was like it tapped into this huge sense of grief and loss, which didn't make sense for how long that relationship had been. And you know, at some point I remember very clearly waking up in the middle of the night going, it's the same pain. It's the same old pain. And it was like this realization that I was grieving for my brother through the loss of that relationship. So I think all of those things all sort of came together. And my sister, bless her, turned to me and said, Tara, you've got to sort it out. And I think that was when I went, you know what, I need to get some help and I need to change something.
Tara, one of the things that I just found so amazing about your book was how you were able to face those challenges, and then, one of the things that you wrote about was having to do the work in confronting those challenges. And can you just talk about a little bit about the things that you did that helped you confront those challenges, and what you mean by having to do the work?
Yeah, I mean, I think there was many things that I did, but certainly the most important ones were seeking help from a therapist and finding the right person. And, you know, over 17 years, I've had 3 different therapists, and they've all been fantastic, but at different times for different reasons, and just slowly peeling back those layers that I'd really created around myself to try and keep myself safe. But also certainly writing my life story down. And, you know, I didn't start writing with that intention, but it just kind of happened. And I think a lot of the book was written not with the intention of anybody ever reading it. But when you write, and writing my life story down really gave me a sense of self-compassion that I couldn't have had, and self-understanding if I hadn't have actually done that, of kind of looking at all the things that had happened in my life and going, no wonder, you know, you find it difficult to hold healthy relationships. No wonder you don't believe in yourself and have any self-confidence, all those sorts of things. It made sense. And I think, you know, writing at the same time as seeing a therapist was really transformative for me. But I certainly did all those many other things in terms of investing in the quality and of my relationships with all sorts of people, with friends around me, you know, finding my passions and finding that how that connected me to life really. And that was a source of joy, which I hadn't really been able to experience joy before that, I think. So that was important. Finding a sense of belonging in being in Australia and joining the fire brigade and being involved in surf lifesaving and community and all those sort of things that made me feel like I belonged. You know, and being grateful, having a little book by my bed that I'd write 3 things to be grateful for every night. And obviously the basics like exercise and healthy diet and meditation and yoga and all those sorts of things. But I think, you know, it really is about work. And I think we're not really taught that to be happy might need work. And I think, you know, it's really that sustained effort of prioritizing, certainly prioritizing my own mental health, but also my spiritual health and my physical health and my emotional health, and committing to that and prioritizing that. And I still do, you know, and it's an ever evolving thing. And I think that we're, you know, I wanted some epiphany that I would suddenly wake up and be fixed, and it would, you know, and my sign was going to be that I would get married and have children, and that was going to be the thing that proved to me that I was kind of fixed and better. And I realized that that's very much not the case. And I think, you know, we're sort of taught in our society to have that kind of, that things come easy and that we don't necessarily have to commit or make effort to actually be happy. And I think that's not helpful for us. And I really realize that work is something that I will always be invested in and that I will continue to do for the rest of my life.
Yeah. I've got a question here, Tara, which it's about post-traumatic growth. And I think this is actually a good segue into this topic of post-traumatic growth. We can come back to my questions in a moment, but what is post-traumatic growth, and how does one acquire post-traumatic growth?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a really interesting question, because it's a phrase that's really come up a lot more, I think, in the last few years, and previously wasn't really used, certainly around suicide. It was used much more for sort of defense personnel and war and those sorts of things, but not so much around suicide. So trauma is really when something shatters your assumptions about the world, that the world is safe and good, and that good things will happen. And trauma shatters all of that. And the growth that can occur after trauma is about how you accommodate those events into your life, and how it shapes, you know, there are sort of 5 domains of post-traumatic growth. So how it can help you to appreciate the simplicity in life. It can help to build deeper relationships. It can help to give you more meaning and purpose, and develop, I guess, your spiritual side. So that's what, you know, it can look different in different people. But I think what's important is that the growth comes because of the struggle, and that you can have post-traumatic stress disorder, which can coexist with growth. So I think that's a really important thing to mention, that, you know, I think we all want to skip the bad bit and go straight to the growth bit kind of thing, and that, hey, we can all just grow. But also that, you know, what we know is that there's no kind of fixed way to go, right, I'm going to experience post-traumatic growth. But there are certainly things that we can do that might facilitate that and help us. And part of that is certainly getting support, and looking after, you know, all the things really that I mentioned, and kind of, I didn't know, I wasn't trying to experience post-traumatic growth, but all of those things we now know can certainly facilitate that process. But often it doesn't really occur till between the primary time after an event that occurs is between 2 and 5 years.
Got another question here. Are you trying to reach a finishing point in your journey, Tara, or do you accept that you're going to have mental challenges, and that there's going to be the post-traumatic growth? They'll always be there.
Yeah, no, I think very much there's no fixed point. I don't look to an end point at all. And you know, really, I think, you know, that whole saying about it's about the journey, not the destination, it's so true. Because if you look at what is the ultimate destination, the ultimate destination really is death, or depending on how you view death. And I'm, you know, so I think it is very much about continuing on that. It's a continual process, and it's a continual process of growth. And you know, what I find now is that I'm just so much better at meeting the challenges that face me, better in a way that, you know, I will still get upset if something happens, and obviously depending on what it is and how terrible it is, if you like. But but I will recover so much more quickly and be able to move forward in a way that is constructive, not destructive. Certainly for me, and that is without doubt the difference. And in a way, the greatest skill that I've learned through my experiences is how can I struggle in a way that is growthful, not destructive.
Just going back to your memoir, you wrote some very heartfelt letters in your memoir to members of your family. Can you just talk a little bit about those letters that you wrote and why you wrote them?
Yeah, I mean, I think they were such an important part of my process, really. And they really allowed me to re-script and redefine the relationships with some of my family members. And even with people that had died. And I think that's such an important thing. So I wrote to my father and to my brother and to my mother. And I wrote really many times over several years. And it allowed me to have that continuing dialogue and continuing bond, which I think is so important, especially with people who have died, and to kind of, as I said, redefine those relationships. So I didn't send all of them. I only sent one to my father. But when I wrote that letter, I worked with a psychologist to be able to construct that in a way that was respectful for me and for my father, and allowed me to be not reactive. Letter writing really allowed me to be not react from that emotional space about things that were so emotional, and didn't, was most likely to be received in a way that wasn't aggressive. And so I think, that really allowed me to make peace with the relationship with my father and accept him for the person that he was and the father that he was able to be for me, and rather than just seeing what he wasn't able to be for me. And I think, the letters to my mother and my brother did the same. They really, helped for me to make peace with those relationships.
Yeah, they were very moving letters, Tara. They certainly were. I'm going to ask you to read a passage from your book. I think people who are listening will find this a very poignant passage. This is actually the continuation of a passage that you read when we did a podcast a few months ago. So over to you, Tara.
Thanks, Dean. I stand still, looking at my brother, my other half, my mirrored soul, my heart, yet also my burden, my chains, my cloak. I look up ahead of me uncertainly, oscillating between the past and the future, the solitude and uncertainty of the way up versus the familiarity and comfort of the path behind me. Adam nods at me reassuringly. He lifts his hand to take my cloak. I remain still, torn. The wind stops. My brother nods once more in an unspoken gift of freedom. I begin to walk tentatively, checking to look back all the while, still seeing my brother looking at me, nodding, smiling his beautiful, radiant smile. I keep walking, my feet feeling firmer on the ground, looking back less often until I turn and Adam is just a spot on the horizon. I cannot let him go completely. I need to be able to see him, to be able to check he is okay. Just the line of sight, that's all, enough to keep the cord alive.
Thanks, Tara. I can appreciate that's difficult to read for you. Can you just talk a little bit about what's happening in that passage?
I think it was just me acknowledging the struggle to let go, and to let myself be me. And how frightening that was for me, and how vulnerable I felt in trying to do that. And that I thought that meant I was losing him all over again. And really it just meant letting go of the story that I had told myself for so many years, that I had to be the person that I thought that he wanted me to be, and to live only for him, and that was really strangling me, and it was about accepting that I could love him, still live for me, and be the person that I wanted to be, that was so desperately trying to get out.
Mm-hmm. Actually, got a very a good question from Sue, who asks, if you could travel back in time, Tara, to visit your younger self, what would you do or say to that younger self?
I would have compassion for myself, and without a doubt, you know, and I would have probably, yeah, I would have compassion for myself, and I would give myself a huge hug and just say, you know what, you're doing the best that you can, and you're not a bad person, and everything. Your mum's illness, your father's illness was not your fault. And to just have trust and faith in finding the right people to help me on that journey ahead, and to help find that support sooner, I think. But more than anything, to be kind to myself.
As we said at the start, you know, today is World Suicide Prevention Day. Can you just tell me a little bit about the ripple effects of suicide? I suspect this is something that few people are aware of.
Yeah, I mean, and I think, you know, obviously my whole book really speaks to the ripple of effect, you know, throughout my life. But, you know, we know that over 800,000 people take their own lives every single year, you know, worldwide. And that for every single person that dies by suicide, up to 135 people are directly impacted by that one single death. And so that includes family, it includes friends and colleagues and first responders. And so, you know, according to World Health Organization global suicide estimates, that means that somewhere up to 500 million people can be really impacted by suicide every single year. And, you know, so it's so many people's lives, and that those people that are impacted are then at much greater risk of mental ill health, but also, you know, social isolation as well, and at risk of suicide themselves. And so, you know, when we talk about trying to save one life, you know, we're also really talking about saving so many more lives by doing that. And certainly the burden that suicide creates, we would be reducing that immensely.
So you've been a firefighter for 15 years or so, Tara. We all know that firefighters fight fires, but I think a lot of people probably don't realise that firefighters also have to, they confront the challenge of suicide from the general population. Can you just talk a little bit about that and the impact it has on firefighters?
Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, we go to so many different incidences, not just fires. You know, we go to rescue incidents, we go to hazardous material incidents, we go to car accidents. So there are many different things that we do, and we also assist other first responder agencies like paramedics and also the police. So any one of those types of jobs can involve attending a suicide. And I think what's particularly difficult for firefighters is that it's not something we necessarily expect to encounter on the job. And it's not something necessarily a skill set that we have, that we feel that we can really do anything meaningful to prevent that. And, you know, when you're number one, everything that we do is about protecting and preserving life. And when we turn up to a suicide where invariably we're not able to actually have any effect over the outcome, or that person often is already deceased, it can be incredibly challenging for us. So I think there are many reasons why it can have a huge impact on firefighters.
One of the interesting things that you're doing besides being a firefighter is a PhD. You're halfway through a PhD looking into the impact that those suicides on the job have on firefighters. Can you just talk a little bit about what you've discovered so far, what the research is showing you?
Yeah, I mean, I'm in the early stages of analysing all the data that I have, but as you said, I'm looking at the impact of suicide on firefighters, you know, not only through the jobs that we attend, but also, you know, when we have sadly lost other firefighters to suicide, and also people have often had their own personal experience of suicide as well. So I'm looking at that real breadth of experience and hearing firefighters' stories. So I sit down in front of them and I hear their stories. And I think what really comes to me so far is that it has such a significant impact on the mental health and well-being of firefighters. And I want to just read a couple of excerpts from some of my interviews with firefighters that I think really speak to this. So this is talking about an exposure of a firefighter to a suicide at work. And he said, "I was ridiculously terrified. I just wanted to run out of there, but I knew I couldn't. I just had this overwhelming fear and concern for my own immediate family, my 2 boys. Could this ever happen to anyone that was significantly close to me? Then I just started to cry. I was just so sad for this boy, so sad for his family, so sad that it really hurt, and I just didn't understand. I was so confused. It was a real struggle to try and work out, to try and make some sense of it. The thing with suicide is quite often there's no backstory, there's no explanation. It just is what it is. But that's the thing that got me. There's no control. There's no, how did we get to this point? I'm nowhere near as social or open as I once was. I do a lot by myself. And then there was 2 other firefighters as well, who were speaking in respect to the loss of another firefighter, so a fellow firefighter, to suicide. And one of them said, the guilt was ridiculous. I just couldn't handle the guilt. The guilt of not seeing it, not being aware of it, and not helping. I may not have been able to help, but not knowing and not trying is the thing for me. I was shit ass at work, and then at home I was terrible. As a result, I separated from my wife. And another one said, I still struggle. I think that's the thing that I will never understand, just how quickly that turned. It shocked me to the core when he did it, because I just never thought that he was suffering in that way. And I think they're such powerful, they just really highlight so well, when we talk about the ripple effect of suicide, how much it reaches so far and beyond immediate family and throughout our communities in so many ways. And so although my story, it's not unique in any way, and that you don't have to know the person. Certainly what's coming through from my research is what a huge impact it has on firefighters, and perhaps particularly because we wear a uniform and our whole role is about rescuing life and preserving life. And, we're so good at rescuing other people, but that also has the flip side of it's so difficult to accept when we are helpless and when we can't rescue somebody, and so difficult to then also reach out for help. And I think what I really, there's such a sense of internal conflict, from all the people that I've spoken to, of what suicide brings up, and it's such a difficult thing to try and make any sense of. And what I found is this overwhelmingly that firefighters aren't able to make sense of it, and that our job is very black. We exert control over uncontrolled events, and that's what we do, and we go through processes to exert a particular outcome. And with suicide, there is none of that. And so it's incredibly difficult for firefighters to really make peace with, and I think that certainly contributes to some of the reactions and effects that it has.
So they're very powerful stories from those colleagues of yours, Tara. Can you talk about the term suicide postvention and what that means? I have to confess that I'd never heard of that term until recently, and I thought I was reasonably mentally health literate. But can you talk a little bit about that?
Yeah, so suicide postvention is the support that we offer to people who have been impacted or bereaved by suicide. And what we know, because people that have been impacted or bereaved by suicide are at greater risk of mental ill health, but also of suicide. So what we're really realizing is how important suicide postvention is in prevention. And really that's where my passion lies, in going, okay, from my research and other people's research, and certainly my supervisor's research, how can we provide better support to people so that they don't then suffer subsequent mental ill health or suicidal thoughts or behaviours themselves as a result of either bereavement or certainly being exposed to suicide. So, and I think, we're clearly missing something in our suicide prevention efforts. I think that postvention is a small part of that we can really work to address and make a significant difference in, and to reduce, that real collective sense of distress and burden that suicide has on our societies.
Well, what is your overall message for World Suicide Prevention Day, Tara?
I think it's really that suicide prevention is everyone's responsibility, and that we can all play a part in that, and you don't have to be a mental health professional to do that. And if we can empower ourselves with knowledge and learn how we can have safe conversation around suicide, that's so important, and giving people permission to talk about suicide is invaluable in what we can then contribute, I think, towards prevention and towards, you know, in a way normalizing that conversation, because as I said, I think that silencing is so damaging. And so that sense of permission that we can create by engaging in conversation and having the confidence to do that. And I think, you know, I guess my real message is never underestimate the power of one conversation to save a life.
How about in the workplace, though? I mean, it's one thing perhaps for someone to say to a friend, ask them to talk to them very directly about suicide, and if that person is perhaps having suicidal thoughts. But what about in the workplace, where there is still so much stigma? This must be a challenge.
It is. It's a huge challenge, and I think the stigma is certainly something that you know, comes in not just in workplaces, but you know, throughout our society. So, and I think that part, addressing those conversations and empowering people to have those conversations through, you know, developing our own suicide prevention, but also suicide preparedness in our organisation. So as firefighters, but in terms of preparing people for suicide, that we might come across that, and that's a really important part of it. And having also postvention resources, and we know that any prevention strategy, you know, really has to be based on the voices of people with lived experience, which I hope is really where my research can come in and go, okay, how do we provide the right resources and services for our firefighters? Because we know that they have to be, all suicide prevention strategies are most effective when they're targeted, they're culturally specific to that population that we're speaking to, and very specific. So for firefighters, you know, specific to firefighters, for paramedics, it would be to them, and in different communities and in vulnerable populations, in our Indigenous population. You know, we know that suicide in rural areas is twice the rate that it is in the urban areas. So making those really culturally specific prevention strategies, and having specific protocols and resources to provide around suicide. And I think that that's such an important part of every single workplace.
I've got a question here. Someone is aware that you've got a big fundraising event coming up, and she wants to, where you're going to be talking about some of your life's experiences. Can we hear a little bit about that, please, Tara?
Yes, so we are with a dear friend of mine, Sarah. We are planning to cycle across Australia from the westernmost point of Australia, Steep Point, to the easternmost point, which is in Byron Bay. So for those of you that are not in Australia, that's the equivalent of cycling from England to America. And well, we had planned to leave in October, but unfortunately our state borders are still closed at this time. So I think really the messaging, you know, behind it's partly because, you know, that's my passion, being outdoors, you know, challenging myself, I guess, going through nature. It's a fantastic way to see the country, but it's also for me about raising money for Lifeline. And Sarah will be raising money for a local charity called Mood Active. But our messaging is really based around how can we empower people to struggle well. And I think that is the most important life skill that we can have, because if we can find ways to struggle in a way that's constructive, we can find growth instead of illness. And, you know, learning that struggle is just a normal part of life. And you know, how can we face those really difficult challenges? And I guess, you know, as we cycle across Australia, we will be unsupported, so we'll be carrying all our food and water, and no doubt we'll encounter headwinds and all sorts of interesting things that will challenge us. And so for us, it is about living, you know, walking the talk. And so we will be doing some raising awareness as well, and looking at, I guess, Sarah's charity is really looking at how do we Mood Active develops exercise programs for people suffering from mild to moderate illness. And obviously I'll be raising money for Lifeline. And so looking at that whole continuum of how do we support people, because I'm also an ambassador for Standby Support After Suicide, and they provide a national response for people who have been impacted by suicide. So looking at, hopefully we're going to cover that whole continuum of, you know, people becoming ill and how do we support them, but also people in a crisis and after a crisis as well through Standby Support. So hopefully that's going to be the messaging around that ride, and I hope that it will go ahead, if not this year, depending on when the state borders open, then the beginning of next year.
Someone's also just asked about meditation and mindfulness. You know, there's obviously a lot of buzz around both meditation and mindfulness, both in the personal sphere and also in the corporate world. What are your thoughts on those, Tara, in terms of a way to manage life's challenges, mental ill health?
I think it's so important. I think it's so important. And, you know, because mindfulness really is just that acute attention skill so it is a skill, so we can learn that. And that brings us, you know, to that present moment. And I think, you know, so much, if you look at depression, it's very much a kind of over focus on the past and rumination on the past. And, you know, anxiety is that it's the opposite, kind of more to kind of going into the future. And so the mindfulness is really that coming back to that present. And so when we can come back to the present, we don't react so much to all these other things. So I think it's such important, and meditation, and just to really engage our, you know, our parasympathetic nervous system. So that part of our nervous system that calms us down. And, you know, we're all at such heightened levels of stress for so much of our lives. So I think meditation and mindfulness has a hugely important part, you know, and more so as the technology in the business and our lives kind of, you know, ramps everything up so much and elevates our sense of stress. So I think that they're really important tools that we can all learn, and that is such a great thing for anyone's mental health.
Got a question here from Maxwell, Tara. From your experience, what tips would you give to someone in a conversation around suicide, be it in the workplace or in a family situation?
You know, I think first and foremost is just empowering yourself with knowledge. But what is really, really important, and, you know, I teach mental health first aid. So, and part of that is how do you have that conversation? So I think that if you are speaking to someone and they start to say things that make you really concerned for them, it's very important to ask that direct and unambiguous question. You know, are you having thoughts of taking your own life? And it's a very, very difficult question to ask, but it's a really important question to be able to ask, and to have the confidence to do that calmly and to know how to respond if someone says yes. But I think, you know, but due to our own, you know, it's such a difficult question to ask, we will find all sorts of ways around it to go, oh, you're not thinking of hurting yourself, are you? And things like that. Oh, you wouldn't do anything stupid, would you? And I think, you know, they're not helpful, because when we say those things, we're kind of saying, hey, well, I hope that you say no, because I don't know what to do. Or, you know, it doesn't really give you an answer. Is this person having thoughts of suicide? So I think being able to ask that question is really important. And then, you know, if you allow someone to actually say yes, and then to just hear their story, and create a safe space and a non-judgmental space where they can just speak honestly and openly about how they're feeling and what they're experiencing, that is an incredible way to help somebody in itself without actually having to do necessarily anything. Although certainly if somebody is in a suicidal crisis and they express that, then, you know, we need to obviously link them to professional help to find them some support and try and keep them safe for now. And there is you know, there's lots of different courses out there, but certainly the course through Living Works, so the Assist course, is a 2-day course that really teaches you how to keep someone safe. But there's so many. There's the Beyond Now Suicide Safety Planning app that you can also download, and that's a great way if you're going, I don't really know what to do and how to support this person, but I'm really concerned, that you can work through that process with them of how to keep them safe for now.
Got a good question here, Tara. Obviously, the macho environment of fire stations is challenging enough for females. Have you encountered any resistance as the empathic, educated firefighter who should just leave it alone or just get on with it? And how do we handle this or act on it? I think it must be from a fellow fiery.
You know, I think things are changing, and I've certainly, you know, I've been in the job for 15 years now. And, you know, it was very much the old school thing. You know, I certainly had the, you know, if you can't stand the heat, get out of the kitchen, you know, and take, you know, toughen up, take a pill of concrete, can of concrete, and toughen up stuff. So I think it's changing slowly, but I do think, you know, we all have our part to play in that, in those conversations. And to be honest, I've been incredibly surprised throughout my years of how many firefighters actually, when you speak to them honestly and openly, they want to talk, and they don't have that, and the walls come down. So I think a lot of it is about creating that healthy conversation and breaking down some of that self-stigma, because, you know, that what we found from some of the research that's come out is, you know, firefighters will say things like, oh, well, I should be able to cope with this on my own. And I think a lot of that comes from the uniform of what we do, you know, and, you know, I think people will think differently of me. So it's coming down of those perceptions of ourselves. And I think we can all help to break those down and go, you know, do I have those views about myself that it's okay or not okay to ask for help? So I think some of it certainly comes from us, but definitely that conversation that we create. And I've had some incredible conversations sitting on the back of the truck or sitting in the mess room at work, and things that I would never have thought I would have, with a bunch of fireys talking about real things like suicide, like mental illness, and those conversations, they change things.
Well, there's a comment obviously from a colleague of yours somewhere, Tara, who says, having received the mental health first aid training from Tara and John, I assume that's John, your colleague.
McGarvey, yes.
John McGarvey, yes.
Yes.
Having received the training from Tara and John, I can personally attest to how valuable it is in equipping yourself to handle the uncomfortable situations effectively. If you get the opportunity to seize it. That's a very nice comment. Tara, I think to just wrap up this wonderful conversation with you, I'm going to get you just to read a passage from the postscript of your memoir, if you could, please.
Yeah, thanks, Dean. And it's really lovely. You know, one of the things that's been so fantastic about being able to, and this is with huge thanks to Watkins, my publisher, that has allowed me for this book to come out again. And so, yes, this passage really speaks to that. So I wrote that the peculiar thing about writing a book about your life is that for the reader, the story ends where the book finishes. But for me, the writer, my life continues to evolve. And what I hadn't realized when I wrote the book initially was how much the process itself would really transform my life and allow me to be the person that I wanted to be. And I'm certainly able to hold those wounds from my brother's death and my mother's death and my father's illness so much more gently now. And I no longer want to rid myself of them, and I use them to guide me. They're a part of me, but I think the darkness in them is what makes the colours in the tapestry of my life brighter and more vibrant and more beautiful. And, you know, it's such a relief and such a joy to be able to stand here today and to say that I am finally the person that I want to be.
Thank you so much, Tara. I love your memoir. It's one of the best I've ever read. It is so powerful, and I learned so much from your book. Thank you for joining us today. Thank you, Laura at Watkins, and thank you everyone else for joining us. I hope this has been a great experience for everyone. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, everyone, for joining us. I really, really appreciate it, and it's so good to have you all here. Thank you.